Hello.
Hello, Matt. How are you?
All right, thanks. Very nice to meet you.
Thank you so much for coming on Chaplin Talks.
It's all right. I would normally say it's nice to get out of the house, but I'm still in my house, so I can't quite say that. But it's very nice to be here and to be talking to you about your grandfather.
You know, I was reading your autobiography yesterday, which I have here.
There
And
you go.
can I just say, you had me laughing so much at some points. And watching interviews of you as well, it struck me that you're actually just a naturally kind of funny guy, which is very hard to do.
Oh, well, that's subjective. Not everybody would agree, but fortunately enough people agree because I'm still earning a living, so I'll take it.
Okay. You started off doing stand up, right? In the early days around London. What sort of material did you do? Was it like jokes and.
Yeah, what I did was I always appeared in character, which is why sort of not being in character feels quite unfamiliar to me.
Yeah.
Doing the Bake Off, which is what made it tempting in a way to just try and see if I could do that. Um, I had this. I'd done lots of youth theatre, and I'd been in the National Youth Theatre and the National Youth Music Theatre, and I'd sort of met sort of queenie older men that used to sort of be around. And so I came up with this character called Sir Bernard Chumley, who was this queenie older actor who would sort of tell anecdotes. And I was 18 years old and far too young really to be doing stand-up. But I just got really, really, really lucky. I went on a stand-up comedy course run by a man called Ivor Dembina.
Okay.
And then he gave at the end of the course, it was like a night school, and I was only 18. And at the end of the course, he sort of gave us a list of about half a dozen phone numbers and said, these people will give new acts a spot on the stand-up circuit. And there was a place called the VD Clinic, which was short for the Val Doonican Clinic.
Okay.
And that was in Belsize Park. And I went and started gigging there and on Sunday nights. And I'd only been doing it for 5 weeks. And Bob Mortimer from Reeves and Mortimer was in the audience. And he saw something he liked in my act and came up to me afterwards and said, oh, I'd like to, help you get work and work with you.
Yeah.
And I was the biggest Reeves and Mortimer fan. I mean, I absolutely adored them. So it was extraordinary. It was, I can't, 18 years old. And, I'd probably only done about 4 gigs. And my comedy hero
It's amazing.
was coming up saying, let's do something. So it was really extraordinary. And I wasn't really ready for it, but I mean, that's a true fairy tale. So I did the circuit for about 4.5 years. And I enjoyed it. It's quite a dark energy on the comedy circuit. I think there's some amazing people, but I think it's a lot of very dysfunctional people being very brilliant at what they're good at, and yet a lot of people were using drugs, were getting drunk, had failed relationships. It was a lot of people who'd sort of it was an eclectic bunch on the comedy circuit. I think it's much more. This was in the early 90s. I think it's a lot more corporate nowadays. It was still not that long since the alternative comedy circuit had sort of been set up, had evolved. So that came in the late 70s in the UK, early 80s, sort of reaching mainstream culture in the late 80s with Saturday Live, hosted by Ben Elton, and creating stars like Ben Elton and Harry Enfield and people like that. And people like Fry and Laurie were emerging out of it, Rick Mail and Adrian Edmondson, people like that. So I felt like I was there a little bit after the gold rush in a way. Gold rush. In the early 90s. But people like Harry Hill and Mark Thomas were coming through, and so was my sort of apprenticeship, doing the circuit,
Amazing.
learning from Reeves and Mortimer, working with them. So by the time I was 20, I was already working with Vic and Bob. I was already in their shows. And then Shooting Stars happened when I was 21. So I sort of got famous before I got funny, which I wouldn't advise to everyone. But it was a ride. You know, it was amazing. And then there was the kind of cultural explosion of Britpop in the mid 90s, and Shooting Stars felt a bit of a part of all of that world and that scene. And we'd have a lot of, you know, we'd have Jarvis Cocker on Shooting Stars, and that kind of Britpop, you know, Blur, Suede, Oasis. There was a real pulp, Manic Street Preachers. There was an amazing kind of energy coming out of London and Camden and just in general. And around that time, I my Sabrina character supported Blur on tour in 1995, which was pretty disastrous. But yeah. And then I stopped doing stand-up really in about 1997, shortly after my dad died, and started focusing much more on my work with David Walliams, who I'd started writing with in late 94. But I kind of decided that, you know, to be all over the country doing stand-up and to get home in the early hours of the morning or the following afternoon, and then just grabbing a couple of hours here or there to write with David probably wasn't going to be enough. That if we were going to make a go of it, we needed to really, you know, commit ourselves. So I did that. I stopped smoking weed, gave that up over 20 years ago. And then, you know, Little Britain was sort of born out of that.
Amazing.
So it was a ride, but my love of Charlie Chaplin, if you want to talk about it, I remember as a child watching the shorts that they used to show, kind of alternate with Laurel and Hardy and Harold Lloyd on BBC Two at sort of 6 o'clock midweek. But it was the centenary of your grandfather's birth that meant that there was a TV series on ITV called Young Chaplin. Yeah, which was a dramatization of his early life. And it was made to coincide with the centenary of his birth, which was 1889, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so that was about 1989, and I was 15 or 16 years old. And I watched that series. I'm surprised have you never seen it?
I've never seen it. Who was it? Like a documentary series? Or
no, it was a dramatization.
I'm going to write it down. I'm going to check it out.
Young Chaplin. I think it was called Young Chaplin.
Okay.
And it was I think a 6-part series, and obviously sourced from his autobiography. And so at the age of 16, I got my autobiography out of the school library.
Oh, is that right?
Not my autobiography, but my autobiography.
Yes. Yeah.
By your grandfather.
How funny.
Which is an interesting title for a great book, because it's implicit when you say autobiography that it's yours.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a great book. So, I mean, Laurel and Hardy, obviously you did stuff with the Slapstick Festival, talking about Laurel and Hardy, who are also amazing, because Stan Laurel and my grandfather were in Carno's troupe together.
That's right.
Which is...
Now, was Stan Laurel your grandfather's understudy, or was it the other way around?
No, he was my grandfather's understudy.
That's right,
it's quite funny, because actually I was just reading before this interview, there's a part in this book that talks about Fred Carno kind of didn't like my grandfather that much. Kind of found him he was very quiet, and he thought that he was very up himself and everything. And Stan Laurel actually wrote, he's quite the opposite. He's just so shy. Just so shy that he doesn't want to talk to anyone. And which is quite funny considering how much of a clown he was on screen.
Yeah, but it's often the case. I know lots. I mean, look at Rowan Atkinson. He's very introverted, isn't he?
That's right.
A man, sort of kind of academic, introverted, can have a bit of a stammer at times. And yet on stage, he's sort of, well, as close as we get to your grandfather now, really, isn't he? He's sort of the inheritor of the crown, maybe. So, yeah, I mean, what you do on stage, I mean, you do also meet comedians who are really gregarious off stage. But, I mean, David Walliams is quite quiet off stage, you know, and sort of can be quiet and have few words. And then, but when he's on, he's on.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's so I've seen that, and I can identify with it as well myself sometimes, depending on what mood I'm in. But yeah, so I read my autobiography, and around that time there was a retrospective of your grandfather's films. They were on TV a lot, and Channel 4 I think was doing a season, and it was a Saturday night. And Modern Times was on, and I wasn't sure that I was wholly into the idea of watching a feature-length film without dialogue. I don't know that I wanted to do that.
Yeah.
At 15.
Yeah, I can understand that.
It was on, and it started, and I just thought, and my jaw dropped. I mean, I just thought it was the most brilliant thing, because when you're a kid and you're sort of watching Charlie Chaplin shorts, silence, you don't really realize the kind of cinematic advances that he made. Not just advances, I mean, just things that he created, that he's responsible for. You know, the language of, you know, close up for romance, long shot for comedy. I mean, just the things that we completely take for granted. And so watching Modern Times, I was really struck by how fresh it felt watching it as a 15-year-old, that it was, I mean, it helped that it was a cleaned up print. I think it had been remastered.
Okay.
But it wasn't this grainy, flickering, sort of faded print with dirt and dust and frames missing that you would get sometimes when you saw his work. It felt really new and relevant, and just from the beginning, you know, him being stuck in the machinery, it's an amazing film. It's still my favorite film of his. Okay. In fact, it's probably my favorite comedy film still. Oh, wow. And it's so funny, and also, you know, in the prison sequence where he sort of has, I think he has some cocaine, you know, in that sequence. And again, I remember being really startled by that, because all you think about is when you're a kid and you see Chaplin, it's the sort of height of innocence, isn't it?
Exactly.
And sort of quaintness. But actually, there's an edge to it. There's a real edge to it. You know, that edge becomes obviously much more pronounced in work like The Great Dictator or Monsieur Verdoux. But it was, yeah. And then, because it's a sort of debate really whether Modern Times is your grandfather's last silent movie or first talkie, because of the sound in the film and the sound effects and everything. But it is the first talkie, because he has that incredible song.
Exactly.
Which influenced me when I later went on to do a series called Pompidou, in terms of having gibberish speak.
Okay.
I would think of that song. I loved your grandfather's music. His ability to write melodies is great. And of course, people sort of forget, don't they?
Everything. Yeah,
but I've sung Smile at the Albert Hall, actually. And yeah. And it's such a beautiful song. But all his music is great. I love his score at Limelight as well. Yeah. My funniest moment, my favorite moment, Charlie Chaplin moment, the moment that had me just sort of genuinely choking with laughing so much I was sort of a bit worried that I might pass out, is near the end of Limelight, where he does that. Well, Limelight isn't that funny a film, is it? I mean,
No,
it's a melodrama.
Exactly.
It's mawkish in parts. It's very sentimental. It is a tragedy, really. But there's that sequence near the end when he's performing, and it's the way his legs go up into the trousers. Do you know the sequence I'm talking about?
Yes, I know exactly. It's with Buster Keaton.
Buster Keaton, yeah. And that sequence where his
so funny.
and the look, his look of puzzlement,
and he gets
as his legs are doing these.
Up.
Yeah, that sequence it's so precious and it's so funny. And I've never seen anything like that before or since. Nowadays, you do that with CGI.
Yes, true.
You know, you do something with the legs, but he no,
he did just do baggy trousers, basically baggy shorts.
Just baggy trousers, yeah. And also, it looks to me like, I bet he did that on stage 40 years earlier or something, or 30 years earlier. It has that sort of feeling to it, doesn't it? It's real. Well, I mean, it is real vaudeville.
Also, in Modern Times, there's that scene where he's on roller skates.
Yeah.
On the balcony. And it looks like he's going to go over. I mean, that was all trickery as well for the time. It was sort of unheard of. It was all painted on, I think, a pane of glass or something. And because he was a very good skater, but not so good that he wanted to try it for real. Yeah.
No, but I'm sure he did incur injuries in his work. I mean, I'm sure he would have done at some point. But it is a really clever film, Modern Times. I mean, it's so. Like I say, I think it's definitely my favorite film of his. I think it's his best film.
Yeah,
you know.
Do
you have a favorite?
I do. Well, I have. It's really hard to ask, but I usually say like top 5 in no particular order. Something like City Lights.
Mm-hmm.
I love Monsieur Verdoux. I don't know if you've ever seen Monsieur Verdoux.
I have, yeah.
It's such a dark kind of film, but it's just, I don't know. There's something about that humor that I love. Gold Rush, all those Great Dictator, Modern Times, they're sort of right up there, I would say, more so than the others. But The Kid also holds a special place for me because it was 100 years ago, actually, this year that it came out.
Wow.
And just growing up and seeing as a child and watching The Kid and stuff, I don't know, just for some reason it sticks in my head. How would you describe silent comedy in general, or Chaplin or Laurel and Hardy, to a younger audience?
How would I describe Chaplin to a younger audience? Well, I do think there's something. It's interesting because there's something, you can watch a lot of it and a lot of it still feels resonant and relevant today, but a lot of it doesn't. And I always think that there, you know, the character that Charlie plays in his movies of The Little Tramp is someone that audiences must have really identified with. He must have really spoken for the audience, and they must have it must have resonated culturally in a way that maybe because America was sort of booming in some ways, and that this big gap was opening up between those who had and those who didn't. And you had obviously the Great Depression sort of coming on, and so he must have represented a section of the audience. You also, I mean, now it costs you a lot of money to go to the cinema. I mean, it's expensive, and back then, you know, before television, the cinema was a much cheaper thing to do.
Yeah.
And you could spend hours and hours and hours in the cinema. You'd be getting newsreels and you'd be getting serials, and so it was almost like you'd go to the cinema once or twice a week, and you could sit in the cheaper seats and not pay very much. And so there was, I think, a sort of, it was a bit more democratic in terms of it was a bit more available for people. So being in the cinema then was a bit like being on television now, or being a YouTube star now.
Yes, exactly.
Rather than nowadays, if you're sort of a film actor, not everybody would necessarily know you, even if you're brilliant. They won't necessarily have seen your work because the cinema is sort of, it's a bit more, it's almost more prestigious now, isn't it? Whereas back in those days, no one was expecting art. They were just expecting cheap, warm entertainment. And so the other amazing thing is, because the films were made without dialogue, because the movies just were silent then. I mean, the technology hadn't yet been invented to have sound. It meant that your father's films and everyone's films could travel around the globe.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so your grandfather was the most famous man in the world. How does that feel?
It's pretty crazy. You know, I grew up in his house. So when he moved from America to Vevey,
yeah,
I grew up in that house until I was like 18 years old. So all his stuff was just around. It's quite funny because we're in there. In the attic, there's his big cases that he used to take traveling with him with all these stickers on. We used to play on it as kids. Now the house is a museum, by the way. But
is it?
All that stuff that we used to like play with as a kid is now all, locked up and on display. So you don't really realize that as a child. And then as you grow up older, especially now with the museum, it starts to sink in more and more.
I think it's possible that he was the most famous man of the 20th century even. I mean, it's just, you could argue that. I mean,
yeah.
Just in terms of pure recognizability.
For sure. Nick Rhodes had a great, he was talking about my autobiography and Charlie Chaplin's biography. There's a bit where he talks about when he's on a train, I think from LA to New York, and it stops off. And he doesn't realize, but there's fans. Every time he stops, there's people out the window, and he doesn't realize it's for him. And he doesn't realize that his films are being distributed everywhere. And next thing you know, he stops, and each station, there's more and more people that are all chanting his name. And he just didn't have a clue. It's pretty amazing.
I didn't. I mean, in a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of that, I didn't realize that Little Britain was on. It was on in 142 countries.
Yeah.
But I when you're told it's on in every country, you don't assume that it's a thing in every country.
Yeah.
And we went to Australia and it was really big there. But I went on a holiday to South Africa once and it was huge there. Oh, really? I couldn't believe it. Like, no one had ever told me. Certainly my bank manager had never told me.
Yeah.
But it was huge out there. Yeah, it's really weird to go. It's really weird to go to a country in a different part of the world that you've never been to before, and for people to just know you there. Yeah. It's really weird.
I can imagine. I can really imagine, What's different about my grandfather's films to now is even the character. He plays the same character in all of his films. It's just that the setting's different. Which in some ways, I guess, is similar to what you did with Little Britain. You had all these familiar characters and you just put them in different scenarios.
Yeah.
Nowadays, in films, everyone tends to play just lots of different characters and stuff. So I think that's why people identified with him so much as well.
Yeah. Interesting though, isn't it? With his comic brain and mind, that it wasn't really until The Great Dictator that he sort of, I think that the first film where he doesn't just play the little tramp.
Yes. So that's the next one after Modern Times.
Right. Which is it's interesting, isn't it? That he didn't think, actually, I'm going to do a film where I play 5 different characters, because obviously he would have been extraordinary playing, you know, the posh, rich, old fool, or a child, you know, or a female characters. He would have been able to knock them off. And I wonder whether those conversations, whether that was even ever talked about, or whether the Little Tramp was just so iconic. He just thought, well, this is what people want to see. This is what I'll do.
Yeah, I think it's more, from what I understand, I think it's probably more that the talkies movies had already come out. They've been out since the 30s.
About 29,
yeah,
I think.
Exactly. So City Lights came out while talkies were already out, and everyone thought it would fail, and he refused to he didn't want to give the Tramp a voice, was his reasoning. So I think as the years went on, he probably realized that he's going to have to start talking, and it was just probably best to retire the character than
it made sense, because I think if it would have become novelty if in the sort of late 40s, early 50s, he's doing the Tramp. You know, you could sort of get one shot at it, couldn't you? You go, okay, this is Chaplin's final silent move. You know, you could do that. You can do that once as a kind of event. But I think, because you don't want to be the biggest and then just become the 40th biggest. It's like, you don't want to do that just because you know audiences are less keen. I mean, it is hard, isn't it, when you watch the very final Laurel and Hardy films like Atoll K, and it's hard when you know to see the decline. So I think he was really smart to say, okay, people want talking pictures now, so I'll give them talking pictures, but I'm going to do something else. It's also really interesting because he could have made much easier films to watch and much more accessible films, but definitely, you know, the artist and the sort of man of culture came out, that the films he made were not as mainstream. They sort of, in some ways, you look at like King in New York, Countess in Hong Kong, they're almost like, there's a sort of independent movie vibe about them, don't they?
Yeah, no, it's true. I think they were made after he was, you know, the whole America thing. Countess of Hong Kong was his last film, but King of New York was that kind of, you could very much tell that he was telling his own story almost.
Yeah, but they're not knockabout comedies.
No, it's true. He seemed, you
know,
to get
and
quite political.
He's not trying to do Abbott and Costello or the Marx Brothers or any of that. I mean, he's sort of saying to himself, well, I've done all of that, and now it felt like he was making films for himself, you know, which is nothing wrong about that. But even when you read, like, I was reading about The Freak, which is obviously the film he didn't get to make, and you just think, well, that's a really artistic film, isn't it? That's not a big, huge mainstream movie.
No, absolutely. And what's funny though is that, because even in his early films stuff, if you watch the Immigrant and stuff, he kicks an immigrant officer up the backside, you know, and for that time it was so shocking that they didn't want to put it on screen almost. And you know, I think that's like, goes back to people just identifying with the character. So there was always some sort of like political thing happening in most of his films. Just as they went on, suddenly he wasn't as afraid to kind of share what he thought.
Yeah, bold. I mean, The Great Dictator is such a bold film, isn't it? And it's such a risky film to make because it's a really big idea. It's grand, you know, portentous thing to do. And it's like he knew what was going on before the rest of the world did.
Well, that's the thing. He spoke out against Hitler before anyone was at war with him, really. It wasn't until he heard that they invaded Poland that he really went for it.
Ein Straff in der Blitzensektor Knütz! Hey, ich kleiner Straff mit der... Balloni war ein Stritz mit seinen Eltern, sagt der Jugend. Ein der Straff mit seiner Klotz Hey, der Stratz mit Sekretäten da, in seiner Tratsch mit Sketten, meine Täter wieder straffen, die straffen, sie straffen.
And it's interesting, and it lays down a marker about what the role is of a comedian, because if you're a big comedian, maybe you should take on big targets. I mean, Sacha Baron Cohen, particularly with the recent Borat movie, takes on Trump.
It does.
And it's great. It's great. And that feels like, the modern incarnation of the Great Dictator in a way.
Yeah. Mind you, though, I mean, you guys with Little Britain were pretty out there for its time as well. I would say it was hilarious. I mean, I absolutely loved every single part of it. But maybe, do you not think that's why people also related to that show?
Yeah, it's interesting because Little Britain was you imagine over the years that people get more relaxed about stuff as time goes by, so that Little Britain was shocking. But there are things, when we made Little Britain 15 years ago, nearly 20 years ago, there were things at that time that were 20 years old that had been considered shocking in their day that now felt quite tame.
Yeah.
Weirdly, Little Britain was considered shocking in its day, and 20 years later is now considered more shocking than it was when we made it.
Yeah.
But that's a future we couldn't have predicted.
No.
But with Little Britain, Little Britain was a bit of a case of sort of throwing everything at the wall and seeing what sticks. Let's just play as many characters as we can, all different shapes and sizes, and ages and ethnicities and genders and physical types, everything, and let's just classes, and let's just see what works. I think you'd approach it very differently now. The world is a different place. Little Britain was made in a Britain that, in before Boris Johnson. Little Britain was made when there was a Labour government. It was before the Tories came in, when there was there's been a heightened sense of class division, I think, since the Conservatives came back in. Little Britain was before Brexit. It was before Grenfell. It was before Me Too. It was before the pandemic. It was before Trump. It was before Johnson and Rees-Mogg. It was before Nigel Farage and Tommy Robinson. It was before Katie Hopkins, before YouTube, before Twitter,
exactly,
before Instagram and TikTok. So it's a very different time when that show was made. Very different. It was it was just a different world, before everything now.
Yeah, of course. And
but in its time, it was, it was the most. I'm not saying it was good or bad, but it was the most popular show for a few years in terms of comedy, and
absolutely.
And we had never expected that. We thought we would be very lucky to get a series on BBC Two that would run for a series or two and would be like all the sort of sketch shows that had gone before us. It would have a few fans, that was it. And if we were lucky, it would have a character that people really liked, because that's what you hoped for from a sketch show, that you did a few sketches and there would, Harry Enfield had loads of money in his show, and I don't think you want to do that. And he had sort of two or three, and or maybe probably had more. He had the slobs, Wayne and Waynetta, and in fact he had a lot of characters. But we didn't. Our expectations, our hopes were modest, and we'd been working together since autumn of 1994, and we didn't get Little Britain on TV for another 9 years. So we felt like we'd been slogging away, really, doing other stuff on TV, but mainly on sort of cable and BBC Choice and UK Play and these other channels. So for us, Little Britain was an explosion. You know, it's like people do a great first album when they've been a band already for a decade, and then they do that album, you know, because that's all your best ideas, and then the challenge is doing the second, third, fourth album. With us, with Little Britain, we sort of it was like we turned the colour up and the brightness up and the contrast up on series 2 and 3, and it became a more aggressive piece of television and more provocative. And you know, we had Bitty and Bubbles and the woman who vomited, and it became cruder as it went on. And some people really liked that and some people didn't. Critically, the first series was really well received. After that, it was really lambasted by critics.
Oh, is that right?
In terms of audiences, the audiences grew and grew and grew, and so the later series had more viewers than the earlier series. So, you know, that's it. You know, it went from being a sort of underdog show that, you know, had its little fan base, and then the critics went in one direction and the show went in another. But it's sort of commercial success. That in fact, the more the show was criticised, the bigger it got. It was the truth of it. And then there would be stories every day for about 18 months. There was a story every day in the newspapers about Little Britain, and people would sell their papers by writing "Why I Hate Little Britain."
Yeah, of course. You
know, as the column. And I was sort of, oh my god, talk about crashing and burning. But no, the show just got bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yeah.
You know, the other thing is, it's about being in the right place at the right time. So,
of course,
two things happened with Little Britain to make it big, right? One thing that happened with Little Britain was that The Office had been huge and was quite brilliant. And when something like that happens, everybody goes, that's what audiences want. They want that. And everybody pitches shows which are their version of The Office. Everybody says, it's a really naturalistic fly on the wall. It's this, right? Every broadcaster looks for those shows. Every production company, lots of comedians and writers go, okay, I can do that. It's sort of, I can do that. And they all try and do it. And nobody does. But it's almost like everybody was looking that way at The Office and trying to chase The Office that way. And we just came in going, ta-da! You know, I'm a lady. I'm the only gay in the village. You know, hello, fat fighters. Just doing really shameless, bold, broad comedy, you know, in the vein of Dick Emery and those 70s shows, you know, really, really shameless, not embarrassed to be wearing the silliest costumes we could. And so we were never tried to be cool. There was no vanity in what we did. We just we're just going to come along and be silly. So that was one thing, which was that everybody was, nobody was trying to do what we were doing at that time. After Little Britain, there was a spate of sketch shows commissioned because everyone went, okay, we now want this. So I mean, that's what happens, you know. And then so that was one thing. And then the other thing that really, really worked for us in our favour was that the show was a co-commission between BBC 2 and BBC 3, the first series. And we were disappointed because we just thought, can't we just be on BBC 2? Like, why do we have to be on this cable channel first? We didn't really see any. We thought it sort of infantilized us in a way. It was like we were sort of junior, you know. So in our minds, the League of Gentlemen and Ricky Gervais and all these other shows, they got their BBC 2 slots, but we had to be on BBC 3 first, right? But what we didn't realise was that was the making of us, because people watched BBC 3 with lower expectations. It felt like a club.
Okay, so
it felt like something you could just sort of discover and that not everybody had access to. And so it was like a little club. And actually, I think, watching Little Britain felt like being part of a club. The club eventually got bigger. But the other thing was that BBC Three didn't have that much stuff. They didn't have that much content, that many shows. So they would show EastEnders before it got shown on BBC One.
Okay.
But they had us, and they had 2 pints of lager and a packet of crisps. And so they used to just show us and 2 pints of lager and a packet of crisps again and again and again. And when every night you turned on, you saw Little Britain. It's like now on ITV, you turn on ITV, you see Bradley Walsh.
Yeah, it's true.
That's the Bradley Walsh channel. And we were like that. We were like, if you turn on BBC Three, you just see Little Britain. And that was it. You couldn't escape it. And this was before YouTube.
Yeah.
And not everybody paid for Sky TV channels. So it was a free to air channel that, in this boom of people buying Freeview boxes, and I buy Freeview and the box will cost me 40 quid, 50 quid, but then I won't have to pay any more for any of those channels. All right, I'll do that. Or if you just buy a new TV, it's got Freeview built in, and you had 4 channels, now you've got 12, and one of them is showing comedy. And that was us for free, without adverts. Great. And people watched it. So we got really, really lucky. And the other thing we got really lucky with was our first series of Little Britain on DVD is the biggest selling TV DVD title in the UK, or maybe the biggest selling comedy TV DVD title, right? And that came out at the boom of DVDs, which what didn't last for that long.
No, it didn't.
Because by the time we did Come Fly With Me, and even the later series of Little Britain, people had stopped paying to watch things. So those DVDs came out before Pirate Bay and people downloading illegal torrents to watch things. So Little Britain, for some people, I daren't say it, was one of the first and last DVDs they bought.
Yeah.
Also, there was a really weird thing that I was told, which was that one of the other reasons people stopped buying DVDs was that they only had so much shelf space, and people just ran out of space for their DVDs, and so people could have a couple of hundred DVDs on their shelves, and then that was it. They ran out of space and they stopped buying them. But there was this moment where everybody was buying DVDs, and I never thought DVDs would be a hit, because I thought they were going to be like Laserdiscs, because like Laserdiscs, you couldn't really record on them.
Yeah, exactly.
And in fact, even when recordable DVDs came out, not that many people recorded on DVDs. So I didn't think they'd be that popular. I thought they'd be like Laserdiscs. But there was that moment where everybody started doing director's commentaries, deleted scenes, outtakes, and you could put a lot more onto a DVD than you could put on a videotape, in that way. And also, it wasn't chronological. You could put the thing DVD in, and then you go, I just want to watch that sketch. I just want to watch that commentary. I just want to do this. You didn't have to rewind it, and the picture was better, and it didn't degrade with time in the way a videotape did. And so, Little Britain, we just got lucky because people were interested in The Office and trying to ape that. So we didn't have any competition because of BBC Three and because of DVD.
Oh, amazing.
So all those planets aligned, and that was the moment when it happened for us.
Yeah, funny. I had those DVDs as well. That's what's so funny.
There you go. There you go. So interestingly enough, if your grandfather had been born 30 years earlier, he wouldn't have had he maybe wouldn't have got those movies.
No, it's
wouldn't
true.
have done those movies because he would have been too old. He might not have been able to sort of process what you needed to do to make films, mentally. Like in the same way that I'm 47 now, I'm not that engaged with TikTok. I'm just not that bothered
No, me neither.
by it. Like, it's great. It's brilliant. If I go on it, I see brilliant things. But for me, as someone who makes TikTok, I haven't really made that step yet. But if I was 30 years younger and I was 17, I wouldn't probably be thinking about doing the comedy circuit. I probably wouldn't be thinking about trying to get a new TV show. I'd be thinking about my TikTok account, my Instagram account, maybe my YouTube channel. So it's just about how old you are and where you are. You know, the fact that your grandfather was an English speaker, going to America where they also spoke English, probably made life a lot easier. I mean, he had a lot of things that weren't easy for him. He obviously came from an incredibly deprived background. Had so much trauma with you know, his father's alcoholism and his mother's terrible mental health issues. You know, he didn't have it easy, but he was just the right age and he had something to prove, I guess. And also, I mean, his talent, wow. And he had such a hunger to educate himself as well, didn't he? Because, I mean, he probably wouldn't have had that much access to schools, would he? Really?
No. Well, I mean, he was basically forced to go to school, but I mean, I think, according to my dad, he loved reading. That was his thing. He just loved reading, and he loved reading about everything. So it seems to me that he definitely, I get the impression, because of the way he grew up, that he wanted to get away from it as much as possible.
Yeah, he really wanted to better himself. And you can hear that even in his dialect. Because he never, ever talks like a Cockney.
No, well, he did in the beginning, and then he turns into this old posh guy.
Yeah, but I don't think I've ever heard any recording of him talking like a Cockney ever. Does it exist?
That's a good question. I have no idea, but I know
I'd be very surprised.
Yeah, at some point in his career, he thought like he must have changed, because I don't think he spoke like that his whole life.
Right.
Especially coming from South London.
This is a question for you.
Yeah.
Your maternal great-grandfather was also one of the most celebrated writers of the 20th century.
I know.
And what's your relationship like with his work?
Okay, so I know A Long Day's Journey into the Night.
Tonight, yeah.
When my grandmother married my grandfather, it started off this kind of big, turbulent relationship between them. So our family actually aren't very much connected on that side of the family. But I've managed to, we've connected with someone on Facebook, and I'm thinking about maybe interviewing some of them.
Oh, you must. Oh, what? So Eugene did not approve of Oona's romance with Charlie?
Not at all. Hated it.
And what, to the extent that they became estranged?
Yeah.
Wow.
And she loved her father very, very, very much.
There's a movie.
Yeah. I mean, his whole life, I mean, there's just so much to talk about, you know?
I didn't realize that relationship was never repaired?
Not really, no. I know she got along quite well with her mother. But with her father, they wrote to each other. We have actually letters that they used to write to each other.
Wow.
It never really was repaired. Oona, don't forget, went out with people like J.D. Salinger.
Wow. But he would have been a lot younger than Chaplin.
Yeah. I think he wasn't even famous yet, actually, at the time.
Right, yeah.
But she left Salinger to be with my grandfather.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
And and she hung out with people like Truman Capote, for example. And apparently Breakfast at Tiffany's is sort of based on several different characters, but she's one of them. From their time, they used to hang out in New York. Yeah, it's all. I mean, my family history is so rich. It's crazy. I get startled sometimes. There's just so much I don't know. I don't think people realize how influential he probably was, especially back then. And he was in Hollywood when there was no Hollywood. He was there at the beginning. Yeah. So, created.
Yeah, he was one of the sort of 4 or 5 founding fathers of Hollywood, really.
Yeah.
But not just of Hollywood and its structure, but just of movie making, of what there's few, isn't there? There's DeMille, and is it Eisenstein and Chaplin? There's a few of them around at that time who sort of set the rules for what films are in terms of even how long they are. And just things like that, just basic things that we don't even think about. That they sort of wrote the language of cinema. It's really interesting.
Oh, absolutely. And, you know, he founded United Artists, all this stuff. He was an incredible guy. I mean, you lived in LA for a while.
7 years, yeah.
7 years. Did you ever go past, or did you ever go in the Charlie Chaplin studios?
No, I never went in. I went past it. And I remember being really intrigued by, they were on the market. It was houses that he'd owned. It was these 4 little houses that were all for sale together. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I'm not sure which one exactly. I know there's lots of buildings that he was in.
I'm assumed he owned a lot of property.
In
LA. I mean, also that's the other thing, which is, you know, without prying, or my sense, my understanding is he was generally quite smart financially. And a lot of those people weren't. And I don't think, for instance, I don't think Stan Laurel died a very rich man.
No, he didn't.
And
Buster Keaton neither.
Sorry?
Buster Keaton neither.
Buster Keaton didn't. And I think, obviously, his commercial success sort of eclipsed everyone.
Yeah.
I mean, he probably made more money than everyone else put together. But even so, you know, especially if you think about the divorces and this, that, and the other, and you know, he lived, by the sounds of it, in very comfortable surroundings, but he still seemed to sort of save and be smart financially, you know, and that's also an interesting thing about him, and that's also probably to do with how little he had at birth.
That's exactly it.
Understanding the value of it growing up, and what could be achieved with it. But also he obviously spent a lot of it on his work as well. And I'm always really intrigued to hear how he would shut down productions for weeks to solve a problem. And I'd just be like, wow, you know, knowing the film industry and how could that be afforded? How could that be afforded?
He just didn't.
So, you know, amazing he spent a lot of his money on art, but just the language of cinema, we owe so much to him.
When you agreed to do the interview, I was kind of thinking, I was like, I have no idea how much he's gonna know about my grandfather. I'm very pleasantly surprised.
Oh, I'm a fan, and I wrote that story in my autobiography about showing Modern Times at the party, didn't I?
Yeah.
Have you read that story?
Yeah. I have.
Yeah. Which is you know, that there was in about 1989, 1990. You know, I was part of the cool kids and for a moment, and there was a party where everyone was kind of smoking weed and snogging each other and getting drunk. And, you know, I came in and stopped the party and said, guys, you have to watch this. And I put on Modern Times to show to everybody. And people, I mean, I virtually had stuff thrown at me. You know, what are you doing? Why are we watching a black and white film? And nobody had the patience or the inclination, admittedly, in the middle of a party where they're all getting off with each other, to watch the film. It would be a sad story if it weren't for the fact that I obviously then went on to have quite a nice career in comedy. So it's sort of, you know, if you were doing a film of my life, you might start it with that scene.
Yeah, that's
you know,
funny.
If I hadn't gone on to become a comedian, I wouldn't be telling you this story, because it's obviously... I'm a fan, and I love revisiting his work again every few years as I get older, as I can understand more about it, and as I get myself more experience. You know, I did a series called Pompidou, which was sort of done in gibberish, and I co-directed it, and so, you know, faced with those challenges, to then go back and have a whole new appreciation of your grandfather's work, because I was more aware of the challenges you face as a director in doing visual comedy. Yeah, and the fact that so many of his effects were done in camera, whereas today they would be CGI.
Exactly.
You know, it's and how he played around a lot with speeds as well, camera speeds and stuff like that. He was really at the forefront of technology.
Yeah.
He really was. And you'd find, I mean, you know, Spielberg would tell you that. I mean, the greatest directors of our time will tell you that he was one of the greatest directors of his time. I mean, there's no doubt about that. So, you know, comedy fans will love watching his performances, but film students will marvel at his directorial capabilities, I think. And that, you know, in a weird way, comedy fashions change. And like I say, some people won't find his films as accessible now as obviously in his heyday. They can be seen as overly sentimental and mawkish at times, and fashions change. But actually, where the comedy may date, his sort of craft as a filmmaker, I think, and as a pioneer, will always be admired, always, because he was there at the very beginning of the medium.
You're gonna say, yeah, sure, I'll come visit the museum, but I'm serious. You need to come visit.
I would love to. That would be a real treat. Thank you.
Yeah. It's really amazing, and you get to see. I mean, it's pretty much left untouched how it was, and then there's one bit where it's called the studio. You go in, and it's got lots of old film sets that shows how everything was done. But it gets into his life quite a lot. It's quite cool.
Wow. Yeah. Well, that would be a treat. Thank you.
No, Matt Lucas, I can't thank you enough for coming on. No.
It's my great pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Take it easy. All right. Bye-bye.
See you again. Bye-bye.